to make sure that this is what I want to do. So let's see what's going on. Are we live? Are we live yet? Are we alive? We're all alive. Baruch Hashem. You checked. Your name's not on the Chev this morning. Thank God. Don't talk like that. I know people, they check the Chev website every day. Oh, my name's not on there. Thank God I got another day to live. Let's live it up. All right. I don't know do one of our participants have their sound on? Can you mute, please? Oh, it looks like my computer is the one that's making the noise, not anyone else's. It's replaying. Oh, it's playing us live. That's what it is. It's playing us. What we're talking about is coming through the system right here. Okay, it's great. Okay, ladies and gents, after last week's discussion, which I hope you've all been learning now, the introduction of the Talmud, today we're going to introduce the Mishnah. You know what the Mishnah is? Well, it's the law. Well, I thought my wife is the law, because my wife's mother is my mother-in-law, and my wife's brothers are my brothers-in-law, and my wife's sisters are my sisters-in-law, but she is the law. Yes, how did you know? Okay, so our discussion today is we're going to see, last week we talked about 4 elements, which I'll review in a moment. That was the written, the received, the derived, and the legislated. Well, now we're going to see how Judaism shifted from this oral tradition of the received laws to a written code. If it was meant to be oral, then how do we have it written in a book today called the Talmud? So we're going to, in fact, by Wednesday's lesson, we will review a Mishnah, we will go into the text, we will see and learn and discover and uncover the precise style, the tight structure, and the tolerance for debate and its spiritual significance in Jewish life. But before we dive in, which is what we're about to do, I have a few important announcements today to make. So firstly, this afternoon, I believe there's bingo, and there's art therapy, and tomorrow there's beating, please God. But please talk to Rebbe and Miriam to make sure to be sure that you're part of it. Wednesday, we have Dr. Stern this week. He's back in town. He will be here in person, and he is going to talk about back pain. Also Wednesday, my shiur is going to go into the text of the Mishnah on Wednesday. So you don't want to miss that, because that's where you go into the text. I will give you photocopies of a Mishnah, and you will learn how to analyze, how to dissect it, how to learn it, and how to question it. Okay, so that's Wednesday in person. Shiur, Wednesday morning, you have Tanya, Tale of Two Souls with Rebbe and Miriam. 10:30, my shiur, literally my shiur. It's going to be a shiur in the text of the Mishnah. And then after lunch at 12:30, Dr. Stern will be here in person, and we'll talk about back pain, its ramifications, its cures, the remedies, all the things you need to know about that. Now, Thursday is a very special day on the calendar. Okay, thank you. It's socialized knitting on Wednesday after Dr. Stern. Then Thursday is Tu B'Shvat. So after the fun physiotherapy, that seems to be a very popular, fun class, don't leave, stick around, because we will have a Tu B'Shvat Seder with the Rebbitzin and maybe myself too, depending on what's going on. And there will be fresh fruit and produce from the land of Israel and grape juice, maybe some wine, get you a little intoxicated. So, yes. Okay. Yasher Koach. So that should be a fascinating shiur and a nice discussion. And now going forward, we're going to focus on our studies here, and we'll find out the more details of everything else afterwards, because we're live and people are getting a little irritated. So let's get into it. We have a discussion today. we have a few phenomena, a few questions we want to uncover, we want to discover, we want to understand and appreciate. What is the Mishnah? We know that the Talmud is comprised of the Mishnah and the Gemara. So today, this week, we'll focus on what's the Mishnah, and next week we're going to dive into the Gemara. The question we're going to focus specifically on today is, why was the oral Torah originally preserved orally? That it was discussed, it was talked, it wasn't written, and why was it subsequently written down and recorded in the Mishnah? That's today's discussion. Tomorrow we will discuss what is special about the text of the Mishnah, and Wednesday, please God, we will study the Mishnah and also understand the spiritual benefits for us, for our children, for the souls of our beloved departed, because as you all know, the Mishnah is something that is studied when a person passes away. We study Mishnah in memory of their soul, and the Mishnah shares the same letters of the word neshama, but come Wednesday, after we learn the Mishnah, we will then understand it. I also want to dedicate this year, in fact, specifically to somebody who supported our seniors programs. He was the sponsor of Dr. Helen Kennedy every Tuesday, and that is Sally Kroc of blessed memory. And he's the one who gave me the idea to change the name from Seniors Club to Longevity Club. So we're now the Chabad Longevity Club, but we still, because of our official documents, still say Chabad Seniors Club. It's the Longevity Club within the Seniors Club. The Longevity Club is the exercise department. All right, so the oral Torah, we know, was originally maintained orally, and there was a reason behind it, and that's what we're going to look at today. Because, when we have a discussion, and we see it right here, although because we are on YouTube channels and that being recorded, that's the only reason I try to keep that decorum, so to say. Also, I don't want to get Clive upset. So we got a police force here. It's good. Clive, were you in the police force before? You weren't, but Dale Carnegie taught you serious. Serious discipline 50 years ago. By the way, I know. So that's 45. That's nearly 45. You were in your 40s. You were older than I 50 years ago. You realize that. Anyways, the idea, though, still it's good for the decorum of our online classes. We don't want too many kvetches, so we'll keep it, every 10 minutes or so, free reign, carte blanche. Then you can say whatever you like. And the idea was, though, that when students were engaged and they were questioning the teacher, you're allowed to question me. Fine. I don't always have the answer, but that's okay. And back then they did the same. And that's how the teachings were kept and were what's that? Kept alive, exactly. Staying alive. Okay, so there's a lot to discuss here. I want to talk about the Roman persecution that the Jewish people experienced, and hopefully we'll have time to watch a short movie about that, and how that resulted in halachic disputes and debates. Because if the law was the law, then why was there a debate about the law? Because we'll see how that went, and why the great Rabbi Yehuda Anasi chose to record it, and when that all happened. So that's all for today's discussion. Are we ready to dive in? Let's do so. So I want to start here off with, let's talk about, today we're going to learn about the Mishnah, the first part of the Talmud. Remember, you have Mishnah, Gemara. So today's Mishnah. The Mishnah is a book that was composed towards the end of the 2nd century, and it was a groundbreaking book because it was the first effort of the Jewish people to create a written record of the oral law. Until that point, it was not recorded. You have the 24 books of Tanakh. You did have other Jewish books as well, but those Jewish books weren't necessarily books of the law. The law was oral, was orally transmitted. Now, last week we discussed in greater length, we looked at the steps. Remember these steps? I told you I want to put them back on the board today. So pay attention. Let's look at it. We started off with the written law. That's the 24 books of Tanakh. Okay? Torah, Nevi'im, Ksuvim. 5 books of Moses, the prophets, and the scriptures. That was written down before Moshe passed away In the desert, the Jews got the written scrolls of the Torah. Then we have laws that were received by Moshe together with the text of the Torah. Those laws were not written down. So the Torah was the textbook. Yeah, you got the scrolls, the textbook that the professor gives you when you're taking a class at the university. But the lecture is the received law. Moshe taught that. It wasn't written down. Maybe people took notes, but it wasn't written down. Then we have the laws that were derived. Remember, derived by the sages from the time of Moshe and on. They were derived from the texts of the Torah. And they were received from tradition. Now, there are laws of derivation. If you open a siddur, the Chabad siddur, it's page 25. The Art Scroll siddur, it's page whatever. And you will see there the 13 principles of derivation. How to derive a law from the Torah. Now, Rabbi Yishmael Amar. Now, generally speaking, that was left for great sages, but we get the rules. And sometimes, especially when you study in yeshiva, you're studying the Talmud, you want to know, how did they get to this law? Did the rabbi make it up? Because rabbis do make up laws. In fact, look here on the screen. These are laws that were legislated by the sages for various reasons and various generations. And those you could call made up by the rabbis for good reason. Whether they were to deter people from violating, from transgressing the Torah, whether they were to enhance the laws, but it's very clearly a distinction between midirabanan, rabbinically ordained, and deoraita from the Torah. We understand the difference. But the first three categories, written is clearly in the Torah, received was what we call the Masorah, tradition, Moses. Now, Moshe Rabbeinu says to the Jewish people, it says in the Torah, you should take for yourself on the first day of Sukkot a beautiful fruit. What's a beautiful fruit? An apple? A cherry. We like cherries. They're in season now. What's that? Oh, an etrog. Don't you grow etrogim in your property? Yeah? Well, how do we know it's an etrog, not a lemon? And what about a grafted etrog? That is not written in the Torah. It doesn't say so anywhere in the Torah. It says a beautiful fruit. That is something that is received and derived. So when you study the laws of etrog, you will see how it's derived by process of elimination, by comparison to other verses, etc. But if not for the received law, we wouldn't know that it's an etrog. Who says it should be an etrog and not a cherry? The same thing you could say about using, let's go back to Pesach. We spoke about that last week. See if I can remember. See if you can remember. Does it say in the Torah you should eat matzah on Pesach? Is that in the Torah? Yes, it's clearly in the Torah. It's a biblical verse. For 7 days, don't eat chametz, eat matzah. Okay, good. That is specifically and explicitly written in the Torah itself. Good. Well, let me ask you, how many matzahs? Is that written in the Torah? No. Does it say in the Torah, eat 3 matzahs, 1 matzah, 10 matzahs? No? Okay. That is something, how much matzah you should eat, which we said the amount is a kizayit. The minimum amount is like the size of an olive. Is that received? Is that derived? It's received. Okay. Now, let's go to the laws of derived. While it says in the Torah you should eat matzah, and it was received tradition from Moshe. How much? Minimum the size of an olive, kazayit. Well, let me ask you, what is a matzah made out of? Does it say in the Torah that a matzah is wheat, flour, and water? No. Unleavened bread. So this is derived. Just as we know that chametz is something that is leavened. So what leavens? Only certain produce. So we look at the 4 types of wheat, the 4 types of, grains, wheat, rye, barley, and spelt, and we derive from that. Who did this? Not me, but the great sages of long ago. And then finally, legislated. Does it say anywhere in the Torah that you need to recline when you're drinking your 4 cups of wine or eating a matzah? It doesn't. And it's not even derived from any verse in the Torah. So why do we do it? Because the rabbis said so, okay? Because they told us to. They felt it would be the appropriate way to celebrate the holiday by behaving in the manner of royal aristocracy of those days. The aristocrats would recline, so we do the same. Okay, so you see a few examples here, and there's thousands more, so I'm not going to do that all now, but you get it, the difference between written, explicit in the Torah, you should eat matzah, received, the size of matzah doesn't say in the Torah, but it's received as a tradition from Moshe that it's a kazayit, derived from the Torah, derived what matzah is made out of, wheat, barley, spelt, or rye, and legislated are laws that the rabbis decided to establish. And we know that there's different customs and traditions in different communities, what people do. Can you eat rice? Can you not eat rice? It's a custom. Okay. Now, understanding this, let me ask you, which of these was written and which was received orally? Not the specific law, the categories of law that you see on the screen. Which was actually written and what was received orally? The first is the only one that's written. Everything else, tradition. The received, the derived, and the legislated are all oral. It was not written down. Yeah, lots of commentary. When was it written down? Because we have it today. I could open a book of Talmud for you off the shelf here, and you will see it's actually written down. So when and where was it written down? It was first written down in the Mishnah. In fact, our sages had a tradition that the Torah was divided into these two categories quite rigidly. They taught that the written text of Tanakh should never be recited by memory. We don't recite it by memory, okay? So this is part of the tradition that verses of Torah, until this day, let me ask you in shul, if the Baal Korah read the Torah by heart, did you fulfill your mitzvah? That he knows the verses? No. Even prayer, we say you should say it, it's written inside. So the verses of Tanakh are read from the written law. Whereas the oral tradition, we try to study it by heart. Mishnayos Baal Peh. When I was a kid, they would say, learn the Mishnayos Baal Peh, and you could speak it orally. If you are lazy, that is crazy. Okay? So you got to study it by heart. Okay, let's look at that. I have a text here. Can you see it on this? Okay, so here we're going to go. We have the text of the Tanakh. We say the Tanakh text is written. The oral Torah is oral. Now let's see that text inside. Why is it taking some time to fill up here? Let's see if it goes on the screen. Okay, written and oral boundaries. Do you see this right here? This is from the Talmud, Tractate Gittin. Tried to put a picture there of a Gemara. The most famous Gemara you're all familiar with is this art scroll set. So that's the picture I stuck in. Okay, so the oral, written and oral boundaries. You could follow along if you're looking, if you got one of these books, then it's text 1. Yeah, but it's a compilation of many of the prayers from King David in Tehillim, other places. Ideally, you should daven with a siddur looking inside. Yes. Interestingly, Agam Berger, one of the young hostages who was released last week, Thursday, remember? She somehow miraculously got a siddur in Gaza. Now, Gaza was a Jewish place for many, many millennia. Okay, Jews lived in Gaza. Samson the Mighty fought the Philistines in Gaza. Jews were living in Gaza until 2005, when they were evicted by whom? By ourselves. Yeah, I was there at the time. Gush Katif. Yeah, I was there. I went there. Yeah, this was an expulsion that we did to ourselves. Anyways, that was an answer to your question. So let's read the text inside. Says the Gemara, Devarim shebechsav iyatara shela amram bapeh. Material that was conveyed as a text may not be recited orally without a script, and Devarim shebapeh iyatara shela amram bechsav. Material that was conveyed orally may not be recorded as text. Got it? So, It seems like I messed around with my slides here. My apologies. But either way, we discussed here written, as in the Torah itself, what's written has to be only read from a text, from a script, from a scroll, from a book. And what was oral, these other three sections, they can be looked at orally, and in fact should be known. You should commit it to your memory. And that's the way it was always done. Now, why was so much of our tradition preserved only orally for so many years until it was written down? Because all of the laws of the oral Torah, all those laws that are contained in the oral Torah, are part of God's will, part of God's covenant with us. And now you wonder, if that's the case, shouldn't those also be included in the text rather than leaving so many of the laws to be communicated orally throughout the generations? Yeah? Why were those not included in the text? Good question. Now, certainly, you could say with regard to the portion of the oral Torah that is derived and legislated, the Gemara actually tells us that all the material of the vast oral Torah could have been included in the original Torah, but then it would have been very, very thick, very big. In fact, I wanted to show you, but I don't have the book. My brother in Florida does. When my father escaped from Russia in 1945, he brought with him a Talmud. Actually, I have a feeling that he didn't get it in Russia, that he got it in Germany or Poland after the war. He picked it up. It was a book of Talmud all in one. That's 5,422 pages. That's a very thick book. Very tiny letters. So the Gemara says it would have been too much to include the derived and legislated laws in the Torah itself, and that's why those also remained an oral tradition. Okay? But one of the explanations that is offered by the sages is that when information is conveyed orally, what happens? The teacher takes greater pains to convey the information with a maximum precision. When you have a written text, what happens? You read it, you could decipher the intention of the text on your own. It's easy to leave it for your own imagination and interpretation, which has its benefits, by the way. What do you prefer, a novel or a movie? So the movie's nice. My wife says to the kids, after they read the novel, then they can watch the movie. What's the difference? Because when you're reading the book, your own mind can explore, can imagine, can go places that very likely in the movie you are set in one particular way. So it has its benefits. But the point here is, got to remember what I wanted to say to you, that what was written in the text might be open to interpretation. There's a lot of ambiguity in the Torah. As I showed you last week, even the very first verses, the big cricket game. How do you know there's cricket in the Torah? First verse, Bereshit, in the big inning. In the big inning. But more importantly, there's lots of words that can be misunderstood, especially since there's no vowels. It is the oral tradition that tells us exactly how to understand these words properly. So when you keep the Torah in the oral form, it means that a student has to put in their effort. You really have to invest yourself into the Torah to understand it properly, to properly comprehend it. It's very, very important that that information, in order for it to be properly absorbed, that people are studying it all the way. Now, let me ask you this very question. How many of us read instruction manuals? Yeah, you buy a new gadget, whatever it is. It has an instruction manual. How many of those instruction manuals have you actually even opened? I don't even know why they still print them. They should just send you online and read it online. Or better yet, a video. You know the story about when we went to put a mezuzah up for a particular person. So we had to go check the mezuzah. Sorry, we were checking, open the box and it's empty. So I say to her, where's the scroll that's supposed to be inside? She says, what scroll? Oh, you mean the instruction manual. I knew how to put it up, so I threw those out. Besides, I didn't understand the language it was written in. By the way, I heard a lady told me, you know how she got her husband not to read her private diary? She wrote on it manuals and guidebooks in her drawer, and her husband never opened it. Okay, jokes aside, what did I want to get at here? That it's not all written down so that you would engage your mind more deeply, right? And that hopefully engenders a greater devotion to Torah study. And in fact, the sages even suggest that the Torah was preserved in the oral form so that it would not be accessible to others outside. That the sages did not want the Gentile world accessing our wisdom. You know the story about this Yiddle back in Poland once upon a time, and he's got a little jar of gefilte fish with him. A little jar of gefilte fish. Anyways, one Polak says to him, hey, can I get some of the gefilte fish? He says, nah, I can't. It's expensive stuff. So please, I beg, I'll pay you 5 ruble. No, eventually he says, okay, I'll take it for 50 ruble. 50 ruble, he gets off the train and he goes off and he sees they're selling it for 5 ruble. So he turns around to this Yiddle. He says, you ripped me off. You stole from me. He says, no, you're getting smarter. You see, no, I messed that joke up because the joke was, this makes you very smart. But the point is that the Torah was meant to be oral, because had we had the books, we would rely on the books. The book is on the shelf. I could take it from there. I could study it. No, the fact is you went to a teacher and you studied with a teacher, and by engaging and connecting, you were more engaged and involved and you studied, right? You had to have somebody who you went to. So that is the reason why, until that point, the Torah remained to a large degree only available in the oral form, so that you had to, first of all, it was kept within the community. And secondly, you went to a teacher or maybe to a study partner. You know, today everybody's going online. You have Rabbi Vigla's beautiful classes online. You have Rabbi Kaplan who addressed us yesterday, the other day. You have lots available. Now that's good. But it's also good to have a personal teacher. And in fact, it says in Pirkei Avot, Aseh lecha Rav, every person should have a mentor, a teacher, somebody you engage and connect with, because they understand you better. And that was the way it went in those days. The only thing that was on a scroll, well, you had the 24 books of Tanakh, plenty of books. How many of us know those? How many of you have gone through the 24 books of Tanakh? No, we haven't got. Maybe we should close the Gemara and go back to the original text. This is meant to be oral, and when we study the text inside, then we could get to that. So the point here is, my friends, that there was a reason why it was kept. So you have the written Torah, right? You have here just the written Torah, the 24 books. The rest of it, the received, the derived, the legislated, all remained oral, and that was for good reason, as you could see here. And let's just review it on the screen before we go to our next slide. The purpose was, what was meant to be written was exclusively written, and the oral Torah was exclusively memorized. And it's a good thing. It keeps your memory sharp. So Cynthia, you might be out of business. If everybody will study the Mishnas by heart, then they won't need to come for memory classes. But until you know all the Mishnayos by heart, you got to go to Cynthia's memory class, right? Okay, now we're going to go into a little bit of history. How's that? Towards the end of the 2nd century, the sages of Israel made this dramatic decision that they wanted to compose a written record of all these oral laws, which until this point were kept oral. What was this book called? The Mishnah. So let's examine the historical background of this decision. Before we get there, I need to talk to you about history, because the other day, a man came in to see me and he says, Rabbi, I said, what's the matter? What happened this time? He says, no, my wife, every time I do anything wrong, she gets historical with me. I said, Yankel, you mean hysterical, right? He says, Rabbi, don't correct me. I have a degree in English grammar. Don't correct me. I said, I imagine you meant hysterical. He said, no, historical. She reminds me of every infraction I ever committed in the history of mankind. Okay, so that's the story of historical. Let's look here a little bit of the history. The rabbis of the Mishnah, now here we have to learn some key terminologies. They are called the Tanaim. Have you heard of Tanaim? The singular of Tanaim is Tana. So you'll see this on the screen in a second. They are some of the most famous scholars in Jewish history. Some of the names include, let's see if you're familiar with any of these. Have you heard of Hillel? What was Hillel famous for? He was one of the scholars, but he actually didn't write it down. That was Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. We'll get to him in a moment. But Hillel gave us many, many of the laws. Good point. Hillel was a very tolerant person, okay? The Talmud says about Hillel that somebody once came to him with all kinds of crazy questions. Exactly. Shammai, on the other hand, who you might be familiar with as well, was a lot more rigid. So we'll talk about them just now. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, he's the one I told you last week who escaped Jerusalem in a coffin. Remember him? How about Rabbi Akiva? Okay, we'll get to Rabbi Akiva in a moment. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, familiar with him? Okay, so you're familiar with some of the great sages. Let us look here at what was going on in those days. And before we understand why Rabbi Yehuda Nasi recorded it, we just reviewing that, we said, well, the oral had its benefit being more precise, and it took extra effort on the part of the student of participating and learning and understanding, and that's why it was done that way. But now, and also kept it exclusive, right? We said it exclusively to our community. But now we have to understand what happened in those days. 99.99% of all the named teachings of the Mishnah are associated with sages who lived a long time before the Mishnah was recorded. The Mishnah was recorded around the 2nd century of the Common Era. And 2nd century of the Common Era. But the authors, the sages who are quoted, lived long before that. So let's look at some of the personalities. We have Hillel. Hillel was a great teacher, scholar at the time. Hillel was the Nasi. Okay? So when we refer to these teachers as Tana or Tanaim, let's just read it on the screen. I think I put some of my slides a little bit out of order here. So let's just get through that. Tana, if you're looking for a keyword, I want to write this down. Tana is it literally means repeater or teacher. And meaning is sages whose teachings are recorded in the Mishnah. When did they exist? Well, it was recorded the end of the 2nd century. But we're going to go back in history now to see when it all happened. Okay. So let's look at the screen here. We have pre-Hillel. Hillel was named the Nasi, the president of the Jewish Supreme Court of the Sanhedrin at the time. Pardon? Yeah. And that was around 30 before the Common Era. So not so long. It's a century. Let's see. The temple was destroyed in the year 70 of the Common Era. This is the year 30 before the Common Era. Now, pardon? Yeah. And the Torah was given around the year. I get confused at these numbers. Let me tell you how I remember it. I create mnemonics for myself. So I was born on a holiday called Shavuos. My son was also born on that holiday, same day as I. Sally Kruk, whose funeral was yesterday, he was born on the same English day as me. So hopefully that means I could have a good inning like him. Now, we were born Shavuos. He was born Lag BaOmer. The year he was born, it was Lag BaOmer. The year I was born is Shavuos. My parents, the Kievman residence in New York, it's called Sterling Plaza, our Kievman family headquarters. And the address, if you ever want to visit when you're in Brooklyn, is 448 Sterling Street. Now, my mother told me when I was born, I weighed 6'13", 6 pound 13. Who could convert that into? Now, tell me how many kilos is there? Okay. And I was brought to 448, her home address. So I always remember now, ever since then, I never forgot what year I was born. Oh, no, the year I wasn't born in 24, but I remember the year the Torah was given in 2448, which was around 1312 before the Common Era. Okay. Now, an obvious question that we wonder is, why does the Mishnah contain almost no teachings from the sages of Israel of all those years before? Because you're looking at about 1,300 years from God's giving us the Torah at Mount Sinai until the destruction of the Second Temple. Okay, I might be off by a couple of decades or centuries, but I think it's about 1,300 years or so. Why was it not written down till then? Okay, so this is why it was written down now. Okay. Yeah, very good point. So until then, we wanted to make sure the laws were kept precise. We wanted to make sure that the laws were not forgotten, and you put in that effort. You wanted to study, you learned, right? And we wanted to keep it within the Jewish community. So that's it. You had to attend a class. And unless you got the certificate from Rabbi Hendler that you converted, they wouldn't let you in. Not only that, by the way, Hillel, one of the famous stories about Hillel, at least one my mother told me when I was a little infant, so that story still stuck, is the story when Hillel tried to study Torah and he climbed, they wouldn't let him in because he had to pay 5 shekel to get into the yeshiva, and he didn't have the 5 shekel or whatever the currency cost was then. So he went onto the rooftop and he tried to listen from the sky, from the, what do you call it, the skylight. And he got frostbitten because it was a very cold winter day. Well, it's summer here. Remember, in the northern hemisphere, it's winter now. And in Israel, it could get quite cold. So that's when he instituted that you don't charge money for the yeshiva studies. Anyways, back to our screen here. What happened to our next slide? Let's get it back on. Seemed to have disappeared somewhere. Just a second, we'll get it back on. All right, here we are. So we said that the Mishnah was recorded around the 2nd century of the Common Era, and we have the teachers are the Tanaim. If you're taking notes, you can see it on the screen. Now, pre-Hillel, okay, let's get into here. Pre-Hillel, very little was written down for that very reason, as we put on the screen, because we wanted to keep the precision, the involvement, the engagement, and the exclusivity. Now, we have the time when the Mishnah begins to be recorded, but who were the sages? So let's read the text inside, because it seems a little strange why there was consensus before, and all of a sudden there's debate and dispute. What? Before Jews never argued? What happened to 2 Jews, 3 opinions? So let's look in the text here. This is a text from Rav Sharara Gaon. Have you heard of him? Let me read to you a little bit about who he was. He was a rabbi and a halachic authority. He lived in the 9th century of the Common Era. He was born in Babylon into a prestigious scholarly family, and in 968 he was appointed head of the yeshiva in Pumbedisa. Have you heard of Pumbedisa? Pumbedisa is a famous city of Torah study in Babylon. Okay? This is a position, the leader of this position was called the Gaon, the genius. Okay? Rav Shariah Gaon served as the leading halachic authority in the Jewish world at that time. And he wrote many, many responses, shilas and chuvas, questions and answers to various questions that came from communities around the world. There were Jews at the time living in Spain, golden era of Spain. They sent their questions to him in Babylon. Babylon was probably the Brooklyn of those days. There's a movie today called Brooklyn, Babylon. Maybe that's where they got the name. But today you would say probably Brooklyn has a tremendous amount of rabbinic scholarship. Well, Babylon was that at the time. And Jews from India, Jews from other parts of the world. So he is known for writing his letter called Igeret de Rav Shariah Gaon, and he explains there how the Talmud was formulated and surveys Jewish history until this time. So here is an exclusive JLI South Africa feature where we have the text view on the screen. So pay attention, let's read the screen. Here he says, the ancient Torah scholars did not publish the names of the authors of particular Torah teachings. With, what's that? Yeah, but relax, let him live. Let him say what he needs to say. Only then can I repeat it, please. This is a public forum where we want everybody to have a chance to talk, okay? Yeah. Not. Right. Well, the thing is, until this point, the context of his text is there was general consensus. There wasn't much debate. Why was there not much debate? You had a clear tradition. All Jews, for the most part, lived centralized together in Israel. And it was much harder for the laws to become diluted and forgotten and to this. Now that Jews are being dispersed around the world, that's where all of a sudden, and you could have a law, there's only one law. There's nobody to debate it. But all of a sudden people are forgetting what was that law. Last week, you might recall, I wrote some letters on the screen, right? And we had different, and I told you what those letters mean. And what happened 30 seconds later? We didn't have Cynthia to give us our memory session, and we all had different interpretations of what the letters meant. So the point is, he's saying there was no controversy at that time. Controversy is only when things are forgotten and debated. They had clarity of knowledge regarding all Torah concepts. When you have clarity, so there was no need to give credit to any teachers. Does that answer your question, Aubrey? The teachers were just disseminating what they had already known. Later on, there becomes a debate. You say it's this way, she says it's that way. Who's correct? Well, first, let's just get it right. What did Aubrey say? What did Gail say? Now we have your opinions. Now we could dissect it and analyze it further and hopefully come to some kind of a consensus. And how did they get to that? We have rules. Acharei Ravim Lahatos, do we follow majority rule? How do we determine that? We're going to get to the conclusions further on, because that's not yet this week. This week is just the Mishnah. The Mishnah, you have the opinions, and the general opinion you might find is either following the majority or the Chachamim. Okay, we're going to get to those rules. The Talmud goes a step further and analyzes and questions. But I hope I answered your question. Yeah? Now, there are thousands of laws in the Mishnah that are given to us without a name, and Aubrey doesn't like that. Aubrey says, if somebody said something, you give them credit. Otherwise, it's plagiarism. And you could get into big trouble for plagiarism. You know, I did my dissertation, my master's degree, 2018. Had I done it today, boy, would ChatGPT be a huge help. But back then, you know, you get into trouble for plagiarism, and I got to give credit. You have to reference. You have to cite exactly who was your source. Now, in most cases, the laws were not controversial. There was nothing to debate. They were accepted tradition. Nobody disputed them. If it's clear, there's nothing to argue about. There were some cases, maybe some laws did come under dispute. So the Mishnah then identifies the disputants by name. Why did they become under dispute? Don't forget, many of the laws that were recorded later on were laws that are not clearly written in the Torah, or there wasn't a clear received or derived interpretation. Why? You had a new question. Maybe a new phenomenon came about. Maybe they discovered rice. There was no rice when they left Egypt. There was no rice in the desert. They discovered rice a couple of centuries later. Somebody came from what country is popular with rice? Huh? Really? I thought in Central America they have a lot of rice. East China too. What's the Central American country, South American country? Huh? Quinoa. Guatemala. There's another one. There was some Jews got arrested. Anyways, I'll remember soon. Huh? Not Chile. Give me another one. Not Brazil. Either way, they had no rice. So it wasn't even a question. All of a sudden, they discovered you can make flour out of rice or almonds or potatoes. Oh, we have a new question. Can you make matzah out of that too? That question never existed before. So now the sages have to debate and discuss and analyze and dissect. What could you do? But that's a new kind of a question. But for most things, it was clear cut, and therefore there was no debate. When it was something new, it was a different story. So the Mishnah tells us what Hillel says. Let's read it inside. When it's telling us that Shammai disagrees with him, and we know that Shammai and Hillel were two great sages that debated quite a bit, and very important for us to know. As much as they debated, and maybe tomorrow we could talk about the source of their souls, Chesed versus Gvura, right? Where they came from, the root of their souls. But also to understand that they didn't let their debates get personal. Their children intermarried with each other. It's important that we know that, because today's day and age, I find that sometimes two people, they can be good friends, but one's a Democrat, one's a Republican, and families get torn apart. They can't sit at Thanksgiving dinner together because one voted for Trump and the other for Kamala Harris, because they have differences of opinion, and it's tearing people apart. And we have to remember that the great sages of old also had differences of opinion, but they didn't allow it to tear their families apart. They made sure they still married into each other. They're still connected in other ways, even if they had a difference of opinion. It's not my way or the highway. We could agree to disagree, and especially when it came to these matters. So the Mishnah tells us Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai or Rabbi Akiva, or Rabbi Shimon. And it tells us the context of thousands of halachic questions over which there were disputes. But for all the questions that are undisputed, you know what the Mishnah says? It just tells us the law without a name, because there was nothing to dispute. So it wasn't that they didn't attribute or give the credit where it's due. It was a known law. It's a halacha l'maisha mesina. It was clear. There was consensus. Yeah. Good question. Right. Very good question you're asking. Is it open for change? No, the Torah is not open for change. It's not for us to. No, also not. So we had we had here a key term before Tana. Next week you'll learn the term Amora. Amora is a teacher of the Talmud. A scholar of the Talmud couldn't argue with a scholar from the Mishnah, because the Mishnah scholars, the Tanaim, came long before them, and they were closer to the tradition. So we couldn't change it. But we could ask questions in them. We could get better clarity. And there were often debates about that. So we don't change the law. Times change, but the Torah doesn't change. Yeah, but these laws, the Mishnah and the Gemara, are interpreting the Torah for us where there's ambiguity, where there's things that aren't clear. So they debated it quite a bit before they came to a consensus. What was clear, they didn't debate, but what wasn't clear, they did debate before they came to an answer. And yes, there are loopholes in Judaism. We'll learn about that. Yes, there are flexibilities, right? So there are laws and there are exceptions to the laws. And that, I hope that answers your question. So we don't change, but we do understand where we can change. So the laws that were being studied for thousands of years prior to the generation of Hillel and Shammai, but the names of all those sages are not known, not because they're irrelevant, not because we don't want to give them credit, but because the differences of opinion on questions of law, they had a consensus. They agreed. It wasn't a matter of debate, right? And to tell you the truth, Aubrey, sometimes being anonymous can have its benefits. You know that. You know, I once saw a video about a college student. It was his first day in class, or he was taking the exam, and there's thousands of students in the hall, and the teacher, the professor says, "Okay, time's up on the exam," and this college student is still writing and filling in. So eventually he comes up, and the professor says, "You can't hand it in. Time is up." He says, "Yeah, but I needed to fill in a little bit more information. Come on, be flexible." Teacher says, "No, rules are rules, and they're unflexible. We're rigid." So he looks at the teacher and says, "Do you know me?" He says, "No, I don't know who you are." He says, "Do you know who I am?" The teacher says, "No, I don't give a rat's. I don't care who you are." He said, "Oh, you don't know who I am?" He sticks in the middle of the pile and runs for the hills. See, being anonymous is good. Teacher didn't know who he is. He was able to stick it inside. Teacher wouldn't know any better. Okay. Just to answer the question about anonymity. But the question now becomes, why were there almost no disputes prior to the generation of Hillel and Shammai? What happened starting from their time that caused disputes and disagreements to proliferate? What was wrong? And throughout the generations, when a new question would come up, the sages would need to derive the law in the new case from the received tradition of the Torah. Remember, we said before, there's what's written that's clear, but then there is received tradition. And there is, besides for the received tradition, derived and legislated. Many students had studied at the feet of the scholars of their day. They were learning the methods of Torah derivation, as we describe. Rabbi Yishmael says 13 ways to derive laws from the Torah. They knew it perfectly. But for every new case, they might spend hours discussing and debating and examining and dissecting it from all sides, how to know the law properly, right? So they really had to invest themselves in this. And when scholars did not arrive at the same conclusion, the Torah provides a built-in method for resolving disputes, which we're going to look at in a moment. Where did this all happen? In Jerusalem, at the Supreme Court that was called the Sanhedrin. That's where these halachic debates and questions and disputes. Before we get to that, I thought I had another text that I wanted to put on. before we get there. So let me do this other text, then we'll watch our video. And after the video, we'll conclude today's, actually, no, we still got a half hour or a little less. So let me just get today's discussion on here. No, let's go back. I tell you, something went off with my, here we go. I don't know what happened. Okay, can you all see it? This is Maimonides. You see a picture of him or a portrait of Maimonides in the corner. I just put that in so you understand, you have an idea. If I don't have a picture of them, then I'll put the book they wrote, but just so you have an idea who we're talking about. You're all familiar with Maimonides. I don't have to give you his bio here. Let's read Maimonides. He says, as long as the Supreme Sanhedrin functioned, there were never prolonged differences of opinion among the Jewish people. Rather, any Jewish individual who developed a doubt regarding any law would simply inquire of the Jewish court of the city. If that local court was aware of the solution, it would inform that individual. If not, both the questioner and the court or its agent would ascend to Jerusalem and pose the dilemma to the greater court that held session on the Temple Mount. So you understand that the court was in Jerusalem. Okay, let's go back to the previous slide. They were in Jerusalem, but there were various courts. Okay, so depending on the gravity of the question, it was determined which court you'd go to. Sort of like you have here, right? You got Bloemfontein, and you have Cape Town, and you have Chwani, formerly known as Pretoria. We are marching to Pretoria. Yes, why do you march to Pretoria? Because you got to know the laws, the rules, the regulations. Oh, was it during the war? Okay. These days, there's this third and fourth world wars. So let's go back to our text. If the court knew the answer, it would supply it. If not, the entire group would proceed together to the higher court that held session at the entrance of the temple courtyard. If it knew the solution, it would supply it. If not, they would all proceed to the chamber of hewn stone. Now that was the chamber where all the questions were dealt with. It's called Lishkas Hagazis. It was a chamber in Jerusalem. Those of you who were here for our course that we did last June, July, on the layout of the temple and the laws of the temple, we understood there were various chambers in the temple. Maybe we'll do that one again in June. Then you understood where the Sanhedrin was based. It was at this section, which was called the chamber of hewn stone, in which the Supreme Sanhedrin held court. And they would pose the dilemma to the Sanhedrin. That was the final, the Supreme Court, okay? Now, if this resolution of this matter that was unresolved by all the previous courts was known to the Supreme Sanhedrin, they would provide the decision immediately. So the Sanhedrin's decision was final. If the matter was unclear to the Supreme Sanhedrin, does that ever happen? Supreme Court says, well, we need to deliberate. Well, that's exactly what it says here. Its members would deliberate on the spot, debating back and forth among themselves, the scholars, the sages of the time, until they reached a uniform decision. If they were unable to reach a consensus decision, then a vote would be held and the majority position would be adopted. How many members were there in the Supreme Sanhedrin? Anyone know? 71, very good. So, why 71? Why an odd number like that? Exactly, you always have to have a majority rule. By the way, peculiar question I'm going to ask you. What if they ruled unanimously, 100% guilty in a case of not accepted? Because you got to find one person has to have some mercy. Right? So if it was 70-1, then the law would be majority. But if it was 100%, all 71 judges ruled against someone, then the case would be overthrown. Interesting. The Nasi, he was called the Nasi, the president. No, there was no presiding vote. His vote was equal to anyone else's vote, but he was the leader. He was the leader. He was the Supreme Court justice. He was the one who held the gravel and did the knack. And he had his leadership was a lot more than just the announcing the verdict. What do you say, Rav Moshe? Oh. His leadership position was a lot more than just in the court. Okay, he declared things, but you do need one head. You need one leader. But his vote was not worth any more than anyone else's, and he couldn't overthrow it. But his decision, the verdict, when he announced it, That was it. It was the final law. No, it wasn't the Kohen Gadol. It was someone else. It could be a Kohen. I don't think there's any rule, but it was mostly held by the family of Rabban Gamliel. It was a hereditary position at some stage. It was in one family. Maybe they were geniuses or great leaders. You know, oftentimes in Hasidic dynasties, you'll notice also that the Rebbes are all usually from one family. The Schneerson family was one family. And if you go to the Hagar family, different Hasidic movements, usually it's a hereditary position as well. By the way, that wasn't always the case in Judaism. Moses' sons were not his successors. Okay? There was no nepotism there. Joshua was more qualified, and he succeeded the position. We'll look more at that tomorrow, probably. Yeah. And do you know who was the head of that Sanhedrin? A rabbi who you might all be familiar with. He's been at here many times. Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz. He was the head of that secret Sanhedrin. It wasn't so secret because obviously you know about it, but it's not official. It's not official. They don't hold. They don't have the same. They don't carry the same weight as the Sanhedrin back then. But yeah, there was a movement and it had some momentum, but they don't carry the weight of the original Sanhedrin. But that's a good point. Very interesting. And he was the head of that Sanhedrin. Yeah. No. Oh, you're saying was it secret? Which way? Oh, I don't know. I wonder if you cast your vote secretly. I wonder. That's a good question. Because if so, it wasn't so it wasn't influenced by. So you wouldn't. Okay, maybe that's. Then it was a public vote. Yeah, so maybe that was done to be a public vote. So just to repeat what Aubrey's saying, for anyone who didn't hear, was he was saying, he asked the question, was the vote secret? I wasn't sure of the answer, but based on what you elucidated, I would imagine it wasn't secret. And the vote was going from the youngest member of the Sanhedrin all the way up to the Nasi voted last. And the idea behind that was if the Nasi, if the leader, the president voted first, or more senior members, then I, as a young schnook, would be, who am I to dispute, to argue with him? So if you started from the most junior member of the Sanhedrin going up to seniority, then nobody felt that you voted with your own conscience, not by being influenced by somebody else. Yeah. So we're ready for Mashiach. There you go. Interesting. Very interesting. Yes, so that would be the purpose of the Sanhedrin of old. But obviously today, that Sanhedrin, it doesn't carry the weight, but they're trying to reenact and replicate. Not only Sanhedrin, if you look at Knesset, besides for Sanhedrin, which decided on religious matters, there was a Anshe Knesset Agdola, the men of the Great Assembly. I think they dealt more with the civil and communal matters, not religious ones per se. And the Knesset today is modeled on that. The Knesset back then was 120 seats. So today's Knesset too. They had different roles. The Sanhedrin and the Knesset had different roles. The Sanhedrin was more like your judicial. So where's that? Bloemfontein is the judiciary. And the Knesset was more of the political, which is, I guess, your union buildings, Cape Town, and Pretoria. Okay, so there were different departments in Judaism too. And like today, the Knesset is more of a political branch, the Knesset of old, but they were considered great sages. They weren't ordinary people. In today's Knesset, and certainly in today's union or what do we call it, the parliament, I don't know if they're all exactly great sages, to say the least. I better be careful what I say. I'm on YouTube, right? So let's just read the last line here. The Sanhedrin would then inform the entire assemblage that had posed the dilemma. This is the halacha. And that was it. It was final. So the procedure described by Rambam here resulted that the cases where disputes among the sages did emerge. So what happened? They resolved, and they would get them resolved by going to Jerusalem and starting with a smaller court, and if needed, escalating to higher courts. A small court had 3 dayanim, always minimum 3, so you could have the majority. So there was no one individual solo person deciding the law. And then there were different courts, I think 23 judges up to 71 judges. There may have been some numbers in between. I don't remember them offhand. But the point is that it was always resolved by a majority rule, but determining and finalizing a single halachic standard that was to be followed by everyone. And this system functioned smoothly from the time the Torah was given. You read about it in the desert. Moshe Rabbeinu set up a system where he delegated responsibility, right? Whose suggestion was it? Yitro, this week's Parsha, okay? He didn't like that one man had to do all the judging himself. He said it became very, very tiring. You'll get burnt out. I still have not learned that very well enough. So thank God I got Miriam here and a few others who I'm willing to delegate. Knowing me, I'd be cooking in the kitchen and teaching. So thank God a few things I managed. I need a secretary desperately. I need to find somebody, but it's somebody who can handle my mishigas and of all the different things I have to. But they have to know how to do graphics for me, and they have to know how to do analytics, and they have to know how to do QuickBooks. Okay, there's a lot of qualifications. But the point is that Moshe Rabbeinu did it all himself. And Jethro said to him, hey, it's not healthy. Okay? So despite the various travails and challenges that our people historically had, we know that it wasn't easy. They spent 40 years in the desert wandering. And then they get to Israel, and it took 14 years to conquer the land and divide it. And then after that, there were other historical stories, situations that happened until the first temple was built, until it was destroyed, until the second. There were challenges. But despite all those challenges, over hundreds of years, there were so many scholars, and there were different, remember, there were prophets who were probably the great rabbis of their time, who weren't only men, right? Devorah, we read about her on Shabbos, right? And the Haftarah. And there were many other greats throughout history, even in the Talmud. And there were hundreds and thousands of scholars and teachers. They studied the Torah diligently. They carefully absorbed their teachers' methods, and they worked hard to reach a consensus, which we're going to conclude now with a video that will summarize this all in a beautiful way. And when they did have a dispute, it would be resolved with the authority of the Supreme Sanhedrin, whose rulings were binding on all of Israel. So what happened? Watch the video now, and the video will tell us what happened that things changed. So let me just get the video on for you, and then we'll see if there's any time to discuss any more after the video. Just a moment.
The ancient land of Israel first fell under Roman rule in the year 63 BCE, with Pompey's successful siege of Jerusalem. The next century and a half was a particularly traumatic period of Jewish history. Judea continued to function as a monarchy, but it was no longer independent. Judea became a The ancient land of Israel first fell under Roman rule in the year 63 BCE, with Pompey's successful siege of Jerusalem. The next century and a half was a particularly traumatic period of Jewish history. Judea continued to function as a monarchy, but it was no longer independent. Judea became a client kingdom of the Roman Republic, and its monarchs were Rome-appointed puppets. Herod, perhaps the most infamous of the client kings, was installed in 36 BCE. Herod was the descendant of an Idumean convert to Judaism who managed to curry favor with the rulers of the Roman Empire. He married the princess of the royal family of Israel and eventually reigned over Israel on behalf of the Roman Empire. During the early phase of his rule, Herod massacred many of the leading Jewish sages, seeing their authority as a threat. The ancient land of Israel first fell under Roman rule in the year 63 BCE, with Pompey's successful siege of Jerusalem. The next century and a half was a particularly traumatic period of Jewish history. Judea continued to function as a monarchy, but it was no longer independent. Judea became a client kingdom of the Roman Republic, and its monarchs were Rome-appointed puppets. Herod, perhaps the most infamous of the client kings, was installed in 36 BCE. Herod was the descendant of an Idumean convert to Judaism who managed to curry favor with the rulers of the Roman Empire. He married the princess of the royal family of Israel and eventually reigned over Israel on behalf of the Roman Empire. During the early phase of his rule, Herod massacred many of the leading Jewish sages, seeing their authority as a threat to his own. He also massacred the entire Maccabean family, including his own Maccabean wife and children. Despite the horrors, upheavals, and deprivations suffered by the Jews of Judea during this time, many continued to invest their efforts into studying, clarifying, and perpetuating God's holy Torah. Among them were two famous co-leaders of the sages, Hillel and Shammai. They and their students struggled mightily to navigate the turbulence of Roman subjugation. Following the death of Hillel, his grandson Rabban Gamliel served as both spiritual and communal leader of the Jewish people. He worked tirelessly to prevent the Jews from descending into direct armed conflict with Rome. But it was not an easy task. Roman excesses repeatedly drove the people to the brink, but on each occasion, disaster was avoided. Finally, during the reign of the Emperor Nero in approximately 68 CE, the dam broke. Assorted factions of Jewish fighters rebelled against their Roman oppressors, dragging the entire land of Israel into merciless war. By the war's end, the Jerusalem temple lay in ruins. Hundreds of thousands of Jews had met violent deaths, and hundreds of thousands more were carted off into slavery. But the Jews were resilient. The surviving population flung itself into the task of recovery, hampered as before by relentless Roman persecution. Despite devastations and defeats, the Jews lay down their swords only temporarily. Fresh tensions broke to the fore when a Jewish leader named Bar Kokhba emerged and led a second massive Judean uprising against Rome. Bar Kokhba achieved astonishing early successes that shook Rome badly. He was acclaimed by some of the greatest sages of that era to be the Jewish Messiah, but in time, Rome prevailed once more, and the Jewish army fell at Beitar. This time, the consequences for Judea were unbearably severe. Almost the entire population of southern Israel was destroyed, and the burned and brutalized land was left bereft of its people.